A tank is meant to be a cathedral of steel, a testament to power. But on the rutted, smoke-choked fields near the Dnieper, it was simply a tomb. This wreck, a shattered T-34, was the epitome of defeat, a husk of twisted metal, reeking of burnt oil and extinguished lives. Its turret had been wrenched half off its ring, the main gun a mangled, pathetic salute to a distant sky. It was not salvageable. That was the cold, military truth, the expectation. Yet in the logic of war, truth is merely a consensus. The valley itself was a museum of catastrophic failure. The air, thick and heavy, carried the metallic tang of spent powder and the sickly sweet scent of leaking hydraulic fluid, a sensory landscape of total loss. This was where machines came to die, and where men were told to look away. Every veteran knew the sight, the twisted tracks, the internal fires that had gutted the fighting compartment, leaving the steel skin bubbled and weak. The regulations were precise, the logistics inescapable. Mark it as beyond repair, scavenge what remains, and let the earth reclaim the rest. This machine, they all agreed, was done, finished. Then there was the mechanic, a man whose eyes held the same unsettling, feverish glint as the reflection on cracked glass. To his peers, he was merely the obsessed. They whispered about his solitude, his tendency to talk to engines as if they were wounded comrades, his relentless refusal to accept the finality of failure. He was known only by the grime that perpetually stained his hands and the quiet, authoritative confidence he showed only when holding a wrench. Logic dictated he focus on the 60%ers, the tanks that actually stood a chance of fighting again. But the logic of others had always been a nuisance to him. He arrived at the wreck on a borrowed motorcycle, the engine's sputtering protest momentarily breaking the valley's grim silence. He didn't approach the T-34 as a collection of parts, but as a victim. He paused, the sun catching a shard of laminated glass in the commander's hatch, a fleeting memory of what the tank had once been. His tank, before the catastrophic anti-tank round, had ripped its way through the front plate. He felt not despair, but a sharp burning sense of betrayal. It had failed him. Now he would not fail it. He ran his calloused hand along the deep gouge in the turret, a track where molten steel had once poured. Annihilated. The word was stamped on the assessment tag fluttering from the coaxial mount. But where they saw a death certificate, he saw a scar, a history that could be repurposed. He started his inspection deep in the engine bay, smelling the ghost of the explosion, the residual heat from the fire. The engine block was cracked, the transmission housing warped. Any sane person would have walked away. Any sane person would have accepted the regulation. He pulled a worn notebook from his oily canvas coat and began to sketch, not a repair list, but a resurrection. Protocol. He was not merely rebuilding the T-34, he was designing an entirely new beast, using the wreckage as a foundation. The twisted gun? He would strip it, re-sleeve it with scavenged parts, and tune its elevation to a new, terrifying precision. The cracked armor? He would plate it, not uniformly, but strategically, doubling up on the most vulnerable points with metal scoured from other abandoned wrecks. It would be ugly. It would be an abomination of battlefield engineering. It would not conform. His first defiant act, the simple, decisive removal of the Beyond Repair tag, was almost immediately challenged. A motorized infantry captain arrived, sent to finalize the paperwork. The captain, clean and crisp in his uniform, saw the mechanic and his notebook and shook his head, the exhaustion of command etched deep around his eyes. "It's over, mechanic," the captain said, his voice flat, emotionless. "The ordnance report is final. We need men on the front, not tending to expensive scrap. Get your gear and report for duty." The mechanic didn't look up, his posture rigid. The air thickened with unspoken tension. The silence stretched until it felt like a taut wire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, authoritative, and utterly devoid of negotiation. "This machine," he stated, tapping the drawing that was already more monstrous than machine, "is not scrap. It is merely disassembled. It will fight again." "Impossible," the captain countered, his tone rising with disbelief. "Look at it. It's compromised. You'll waste materials, you'll waste time we don't have. I am ordering you to abandon this wreck." The mechanic finally met the captain's gaze. His eyes held not just defiance, but a profound, almost chilling conviction. He didn't raise his voice, he simply held a piece of warped steel, the metal still stained red with rust and memory. "The enemy expects a retreat. They expect this wreck to remain silent. That is their expectation. I am telling you the reality. It will not just live. It will be better, faster, meaner. We will use their own destruction against them." The captain faltered, caught between the crushing weight of protocol and the unexpected, passionate force of the man before him. He saw the fire in the mechanic's eyes, the paradoxical belief that the most beautiful creation could be forged from the ugliest debris. The order to abandon it died on the captain's lips, replaced by a terrible, sinking curiosity. The mechanic turned back to the wreck, picking up a heavy hammer, the first rhythmic clang of steel on steel ringing out like a rogue heartbeat in the Valley of the Dead. The resurrection had begun. The world shrank to the dimensions of the shattered tank. The greater war, the chaotic, desperate conflict that demanded all men and every working weapon, receded, becoming a distant, constant thrum on the horizon, an expectation the mechanic deliberately ignored. For him, the only reality was the steel husk under his hand and the grueling, isolated devotion it demanded. Weeks bled into one another, marked not by dates, but by the slow, painful resurrection of metal. The work was precise, almost liturgical. He worked within a bubble of total concentration, the metallic scent of fresh cuts and the bitter, oily residue of the engine bay serving as his atmosphere. The rhythmic clang of the hammer became a defiant pulse, a counter-narrative to the stuttering mortar fire that still echoed from the nearby ridges. Others were fighting on the line, sacrificing flesh. He was here, fighting a war of geometry and physics, sacrificing sleep and sanity to a vision. He had no crew, only the skeletal remains of the T-34 and the sprawling graveyard of scrap metal he had dragged and hauled from neighboring wrecks. Every piece was a decision, a moral choice. To use standard components was merely repair. To innovate with scavenged, non-regulation pieces was to create. He was not merely restoring the machine to its factory state, he was correcting its historical flaws. This was the contrast-based development that fueled him, the beautiful, meditative rhythm of creation against the ugly, frantic rhythm of destruction. The engine came first, a complex surgery performed in the open air. The cracked block was stitched with cold welds and bound with heavy steel plates, scavenged from a discarded rail car. He pushed the limits, recalibrating the fuel injection system far past the factory tolerance. He knew the risk. A conventional engineer would call it a ticking bomb. But convention had failed. Convention had seen the tank destroyed. This resurrected engine would run hotter, louder, but it would deliver a burst of speed no enemy data sheet would account for. It would not just live, it would be better. The gun was a deeper obsession. The main barrel was beyond saving. He located a replacement but refused to install it. Instead, he meticulously disassembled the firing mechanism, jury-rigging a new breech with components stripped from an anti-aircraft gun. The shell would fly hotter, faster, and with a trajectory that was dangerously unstable, but it would penetrate. He cared nothing for the perfect grouping, he cared only for the one devastating, conclusive strike. He worked in the pale light of a single bulb, his breath misting in the cool night air, the oil and dirt acting as a second skin, a layer of functional armor against the exhaustion that threatened to swallow him. There were moments, deep in the dark, where the exhaustion became acute and the line between man and machine blurred. His perspective narrowed. They called me mad. They couldn't understand the logic of the forge. They saw scrap. I saw possibility. This tank, it was me, wounded, broken open, and refusing to stop. Every rivet, every weld, was an affirmation. I felt the cold metal against my cheek, and it was a comfort. It was honest. It didn't lie like men did. We would finish this together. We had to. This was the core of his drive. The machine was not a tool. It was a comrade, brutally wounded, now being equipped for vengeance. He reinforced the hull not with seamless rolled plate, but with jagged overlapping layers of hardened metal from 3 different vehicles, bolted and welded in an aggressive, haphazard pattern. It looked monstrous, a patchwork beast like a mythological golem crudely assembled from the ruins of a collapsed civilization. But the redundant layers, the unexpected angles, they offered a strange, unconventional strength. It was ugly, yes, but it was functional, carrying the scars of every single machine that had fallen in that valley. He repeated the phrase like a mantra when the work became overwhelming, when the official couriers would stop by, frowning, only to leave again, shaking their heads at his solitary folly. He watched them go, these men of order and paperwork, retreating to their tidy world of rules. His world was chaos, channeled and controlled. It would not just live, it would be better. The final stage was the paint. He didn't use the regulation green. Instead, he coated the patched monster in a thick, matte black tar, a protective skin against the moisture and the elements. It absorbed the light, lending the tank a predatory, silent aspect. It was finished. The noise of the distant war was still there, the omnipresent expectation of conflict. But now another noise was added, the throaty, uneven roar of an engine that had been rebuilt, not for longevity, but for a single, defining confrontation. A beast had been resurrected, an aberration of engineering prepared to meet the tidy, conventional destruction of the enemy with its own, far more savage reality. The moment of stillness before the engine's first true roar was the final, deepest breath before a plunge. For weeks the work had been a quiet, relentless ritual. Now the pacing accelerated, driven by the frantic timeline of a war that would not wait. The resurrected T-34 sat, inert and defiant, bathed in the sharp morning light. It was no longer a sleek, predictable fighting vehicle. It was a monster, a patchwork of overlapping, jagged metal plates bolted onto the original hull, creating a grotesque, asymmetrical profile. Its matte black coating absorbed the light, making it look heavier, somehow darker than the standard issue. Dramatic irony hung thick in the air. We, the observers, knew the truth hammered into every layer of its scrap armor. This machine was not a wreck brought back to life, but an improvement on death. It was designed to defy the very laws of military probability. Yet, to the approaching officers, it was merely an insult to regulation. They saw the non-standard gun mantle, the crude external stowage bins welded haphazardly to the sides, the unnerving sound of its unnaturally high-tuned engine ticking over. They saw an obvious, dangerous oddity. The tension mounted with every crisp, echoing bootstep. The commanding officer, a man named Major Kuznetsov, whose life was governed by the efficiency of the rulebook, walked a full circle around the tank, his face a mask of escalating disapproval. He stopped at the twisted, re-sleeved gun, its bore now slightly wider than regulation, its muzzle bearing the raw, unfinished scars of the mechanic's private forge. "Mechanic," Kuznetsov stated, his voice a low, disciplined register of contempt. "This is unauthorized. It is dangerous. It violates every specification of the field manual." The mechanic stood next to his creation, not in defense, but in ownership. "It violates the specifications that led to its destruction, Major. It lives. That is the only specification that matters now." Kuznetsov ignored the defiance and turned to the newly assigned crew, 3 men pulled from a hospital ward and a reserve unit, their faces pale with skepticism. They looked at the tank, their new home, with a terror usually reserved for the enemy. They didn't see a miracle. They saw a ticking, jury-rigged coffin. "The test is standard," the major commanded, his voice tight. "A maneuver course and a precision firing drill." The trial run was excruciating. The patched-up engine roared, but the crude welding of the transmission housing threw the gear changes off balance. The tank stuttered and lunged. During the precision firing drill, the jury-rigged gun, powerful but unstable, recoiled violently and sent the first shell a full 2 meters off target. The crew, already unnerved, were shaken further. The machine failed the conventional test spectacularly. Kuznetsov's jaw tightened. "A complete failure. It's too heavy, too unstable, and the gun is dangerously inaccurate. You wasted resources on a folly." The mechanic stepped forward, the grime on his face suddenly seeming like war paint. This was the moment of clash. Logic against instinct. "The tank is not built for precision on a firing range, Major. It is built for survival in an ambush. I built it for a moment that defies the rule book." He looked at the pale-faced commander of the crew, a young sergeant named Borodin. "Sergeant, take it across the ditch, then full throttle through the copse. Fire the second round while turning, immediately." Borodin hesitated, but something in the mechanic's fierce, desperate eyes compelled him. He climbed back into the driver's seat. This was the unconventional maneuver. The engine screamed, a sound now closer to a hungry animal than a machine. The heavy patched armor, which had slowed it on the smooth track, gave it traction in the mud. It lurched across the simulated battlefield. Where a regulation tank would have maintained a careful speed, the re-sleeved engine delivered its burst of illicit power. The tank accelerated across the uneven terrain, faster than anyone expected, shaking like a fever dream. Then Borodin executed the order, firing while turning. The tank spun under the momentum of the shot, a terrifying controlled skid. The shell did not hit the target it was aimed at, but the high velocity and unstable trajectory caused it to shatter a far more heavily reinforced target post 20 yards further down the range. It was wildly inaccurate by the book, but devastatingly potent. The sound of the detonation was sharp, conclusive. Silence fell again. The major stared at the smoking post, then at the behemoth idling before him. He saw the truth, grudgingly, but clearly. This machine could not operate by the rules. It could not follow formation. It was a terrifying weapon of last resort, a machine of instinct and raw, channeled power. It had failed the test of order, but passed the test of survival. Kuznetsov inhaled sharply, the taste of defeat mingling with the scent of spent powder. The dialogue was sparse, the words heavy with consequence. "It's not regulation," the major said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive," the mechanic countered, his voice steady. Kuznetsov looked at the grotesque black mass one last time, an expression of profound resignation crossing his face. The Army needed every single gun, even this mad one. He saw the risk, the non-standard chaos this tank would unleash, but he also saw the terrifying, undeniable power in its patchwork hide. "You have your machine, mechanic, but if it breaks down, it stays where it drops, and if it draws unnecessary attention to the line, you will answer for it." It was not approval. It was a begrudging, terrified acceptance. The monster was released. The black beast rolled toward the front, a silent shadow among the churning dust of conventional warfare. Its entry point was not a measured deployment, but a desperate throw of the dice. The deepest breach in the line, a sector where tanks were not expected to survive the hour. The expectation, echoing through the high command, was that the non-standard machine would fail immediately, spectacularly, taking its foolish creator's obsession down with it. It was a sacrifice, nothing more. But this machine had been born of scorn and defiance, and it moved with a savage grace. The overtuned engine, the mechanic's dark heart of the tank, was not merely fast, it was instant. It delivered a brutal, illegal surge of power that launched the heavy, scrap-plated chassis forward. The tank became a blur of relentless, unconventional fighting, ignoring the cautious pace of the regulation units. It didn't advance. It charged. The first incoming shell struck the patched-up side armor with a deafening metallic shriek. It was an anti-tank round designed to punch through regulation steel. The crew braced for the inevitable shrapnel, the blinding flash of penetration. But the round detonated against the crude, overlapping layers of scavenged plate. The tank shuddered, the lights flickered, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burnt paint and fused metal. Yet the shell had been stopped. The patched armor held. This was the reality. The beast wore its scars well. Its ugliness was its strength. Inside the turret, Sergeant Borodin, the gunner, worked the strange jury-rigged breech. His hands were slick with sweat, his breath ragged. He wasn't aiming by the book. He was relying on instinct, correcting for the weapon's terrifying, unstable trajectory. The gun fired, not with a controlled boom, but with a tearing, high-pitched crack. The projectile, launched at its illicit velocity, found a weakness in an enemy vehicle's frontal shield, penetrating where standard shells had only ricocheted. Devastating efficiency was bought at the price of sheer human terror. The mechanic was not in the tank. He was in a small remote command post, clutching the headset, listening to the strained metal and the desperate radio calls, his fingers tracing the diagram of the beast he had built. He heard the ragged breathing of the driver, the frantic shouts of the commander, the raw scream of the engine fighting its own limits. He was the guardian, the anchor to the steel. Every agonizing sound, the screech of metal tearing under a near miss, the violent clang of a successful gear shift, the sharp concussive boom of the enhanced gun, was a note in the song of its life. The fighting was less a calculated engagement and more a savage street fight. The tank moved and fought in a way the enemy could not predict. It used its speed to flank, its bizarre, heavy plating to deflect, and its singular gun to deliver one definitive, shattering blow before vanishing into the smoke. It was an engine of chaos, born of the mechanic's controlled obsession. The enemy's expectation of a slow, tactical battle evaporated as the black mass appeared and disappeared like a malevolent specter. Look at the scrap now. The narrative pauses, a sudden, slower moment in the heart of the chaos. The noise of battle seems to recede, leaving only the sound of heavy rain beginning to fall, washing the grime off the radio tent. What is the nature of creation that springs from utter destruction? This machine was not an achievement of industry. It was an act of pure will, a refusal to accept the boundaries of what was lost. The mechanic had taken a corpse and, through unrelenting focus, had breathed into it a terrible, beautiful new life. But the cost was evident in the fear crackling over the wire, in the sheer strain on the human beings locked within the steel. Singular focus might forge a new god of war, but it demands everything of its congregation. It begs the question, is genius simply obsession armed with a welder? Then the static breaks, sharp and urgent, dragging the reflection back into the bloody present. Contact! Heavy armor! 300 meters! The mechanic snaps back. He closes his eyes, picturing the exact stresses on his patched armor, the maximum RPM he squeezed from the resleeved gun. He knows the limits of his machine. He has only one order, a quiet, precise command into the headset. Full power. Engage them head-on. Show them what better looks like. The engine screams, reaching an ear-splitting, illegal pitch. The black tank surges forward, abandoning all notion of cover or caution, heading directly for the threat. It is the purest expression of the mechanic's vision. A beast willing to break every rule, even its own, for a chance at brutal victory. The climax is not merely a fight, it is the ultimate, terrifying proof of concept. The dawn found the valley silent again, but the silence felt different. It was heavy, conclusive, not the ominous pause before more violence. Where once there was the expectation of annihilation, there was now a profound, unnerving quiet. And in the center of the stillness sat the T-34, the resurrected beast. It had survived. It had done more than survive. It had ripped a hole in the enemy's advance and then refused to stop running until the fight had burned itself out. But victory had been brutal. The scrap armor was scarred not just by fire, but by history. One entire side was concaved, bearing the terrible, scorched mark of the heavy anti-tank round it had miraculously deflected. The matte black tar was flaking, revealing the chaotic patchwork of mismatched, hastily welded plates beneath. Bronze from a broken statue, hardened steel from a factory roof. It was a machine of war, but also a monument to desperation. It was no longer a tank, it was a mythical creature, a golem forged in the fires of human refusal. Major Kuznetsov arrived, his crisp uniform an absurd counterpoint to the battlefield's chaos. He did not approach the tank with the rigid disapproval of the previous week, but with a terrifying, almost religious awe. He ran his hand over the dented hull, feeling the immense, channeled energy of the near miss that had failed to breach the mechanic's defenses. His eyes, once full of rules, now held a profound realization. They hadn't just saved a tank, they had witnessed the birth of an idea. Kuznetsov finally understood the mechanic's folly, the stubborn, isolated dedication that had seemed like madness. It wasn't about the machine's parts, it was about the machine's will. The official reports, the neat specifications, the factory blueprints, they all imposed arbitrary limits on what steel could endure. The mechanic's so-called madness was simply the fierce, uncompromising refusal to accept those boundaries. He had taken what was worthless, what was deemed dead by the calculus of probability, and forced it into a higher state of being. He found the mechanic slumped on a crate, his face streaked with grime and utter exhaustion, staring at his creation. The major did not speak of the non-regulation gun or the danger of the overtuned engine. His voice was subdued, heavy with a new understanding. It should not have held, Kuznetsov admitted, the weight of his conventional belief finally shattered. By every law of physics and engineering, that plate should have cracked. We lost two standard units to lesser fire. The mechanic simply nodded, his gaze distant. Dialogue was sparse but impactful. The laws of desperation, he murmured, his voice hoarse, are stronger than the laws of physics. This was the truth revealed. The real enemy had never been the opposing army, but the limits imposed by logic, by resource constraints, by the tyranny of the possible. The true power of innovation is not found in pristine designs, but in the desperate will to make something out of nothing. This patchwork behemoth, a glorious collection of scraps, stood as undeniable proof. Its victory was not a fluke. It was a testament to the fact that when every structure is broken, the fragments themselves contain untapped potential. The machine would be recovered, repaired, and sent out again. But it would never be regulation. It had earned its mythic status, becoming a whispered echo of hope among the retreating ranks. The black tank that defied the inevitable. It showed them that failure was not final, but merely the starting point for a deeper, more brutal kind of creation. We look upon these historical moments, these stark choices made at the knife edge of survival, and we see genius. But was it genius, or was it the singular unrelenting focus of a man who loved the cold honesty of steel more than the false comfort of rules? Was it inspiration, or was it the lonely, unforgiving toll of obsession? What do you choose to save when everything else is lost? Do you cling to the blueprints of a perfect world, or do you take the wreckage in your hands and with blood and fire build a monster that can survive the reality you now face? It is a question that lingers long after the smoke clears.